Read One Communication presents The Scholar's Chair. This program is brought to you in celebration of 1400 years of Islam's contribution to spiritual and intellectual development. Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. My name is Khalil. It was Ibn Khaldun, the famous great historian, who said, "He who finds a new path is a pathfinder, even if the trail has to be found again by others. And he who walks far ahead of his contemporaries is a leader, even though centuries pass before he is recognized as such." Tonight, a discussion about renowned scholar Ibn Khaldun. To inform us about Khaldun's writings, we have invited to the Scholar's Chair a scientist, an author, an educator, and the director of the Minaret Freedom Institute, Dr. Imad ad-Deen Ahmad. Dr. Ahmad, welcome to the Scholar's Chair.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
My friend, I wanted to start with a historical overview of Ibn Khaldun, to see if we can actually place him in time and space. And perhaps you can just give us a slight sketch overview of this great scholar.
Certainly. Well, he lived in the mostly in the 14th century, a little bit at the beginning of the 15th century. He was of Arab descent and originally born in the northwest Africa, in the Maghreb. But his family had come with the Arabs early on in the spread of Islam to Spain. And his family was one of the leading families of Seville. He himself became a great scholar, student of history. He was mainly known as a historian, but he left, when he was about 50 years old, he left Northwest Africa and did quite a bit of traveling, becoming an advisor, a courtier, a vizier, to some of the leading rulers in the Muslim world. However, he was always involved in or the victim of intrigues and seemed to habitually be running for his life from one polity to another. His writings, especially the Muqaddimah that we're going to talk about tonight, were extremely influential and seminal because he was the first historian to take an attitude of what we would call a scientific approach to history. Before him, historians tended to be normative. They would talk about history almost as if they were talking about parables for drawing moral guidance, whereas he analyzed history scientifically and is called the father of sociology, the father of economics, the father of, you name it, as his approach to history spawned a whole set of social sciences.
It's interesting. Now he is writing this great work just before the Renaissance. Are we correct in assuming
That's
that?
right. His writings are late in the Muslim era. It was at this time, of course, that the Spaniards were slowly reconquering Spain from the Muslims. He, of course, his own family, or at least his branch of the family, had already fled before the onslaught to North Africa.
So he's in a lot of upheaval.
Right. And his, at that critical point, just as the West is beginning to develop its own development of these sciences that in the preceding centuries they had gathered from the Muslims. But they had not yet gotten all of it. The fall of Granada was to wait until 1492. So he was almost well, about 100 years before that. So he's still in the late stages of the time when the Muslim civilization is still the dominant one, but at a time when the Western civilization is on the rise.
That's interesting. Can you explain to us this great body of work that seems to be over across 6 volumes of material? Can you explain what the Muqaddimah is? And
yeah, certainly. First off, I have to explain the context. He was writing a multi-volume history of the world. And he wanted to describe everything that had happened in history. Now, in those days, when you wrote a book, it was traditional that you would write an introduction. The introduction would be short. Could be a few paragraphs, a few pages. However, his introduction and the first volume of the series came to be called together the Muqaddimah, were in themselves eventually 3 volumes, as we have them now. In fact, and the reason it was so long was because he was well aware that he had discovered something very new and very radical. The fact that history is controlled by forces, that there are social forces that take place that can explain the rise and the fall of dynasties, indeed the rise and fall of civilizations. And so he wanted to explain at some length the theory that he would then, in the subsequent volumes of the book, give the examples. So he's really using the same kind of scientific method that the Muslims had already developed in the natural sciences.
I see.
He was applying it to the social sciences and indeed creating the social sciences, because I said before him, you couldn't really talk about them as sciences. But his approach was to look at the empirical facts, to hypothesize a theoretical structure, and then to test the theoretical structure against the empirical facts.
I see. I see. Interesting. Tell me, because he talks about, the phrase is mentioned quite often, universal history, universal history. Tell me, how can that possibly be with his ability to do limited travel? I mean, I don't know why that idea comes to mind, but
well, of course, it wasn't as universal as he may have liked it to be, or perhaps even thought of it in his own mind. Certainly not the way that history can be done when it's done at its best today. But compared to anything that was done before him, it was a universal history. He would rely on the literature. He would go back. Now, it's true that some of the literatures of the earliest periods are somewhat questionable, but he himself did not take a totally uncritical attitudes toward them. Yes, he was probably less critical towards these early histories than we would be today. But again, much more critical than anybody before him had been. For example, his insistence on the use of citation. He would question, even though he himself was not as consistent about it as a modern scholar would have to be, but he was very critical of those who came before him for taking at face values things that they had heard, and it was really hearsay, and treating it as if it was a scientific history.
So he's dealing with what causes the rise of civilizations. Can you give me an example of that, just in his writings? What causes the rise of civilization? Well, in his view.
First off, he observes a pattern in the rise and fall of civilizations, and although he is arguing for this pattern from his historical studies, it's fascinating to me the degree to which it correlates with the pattern described in the Quran, which talks about the rise and fall of civilizations. Of course, the Quran addresses it strictly from a moral point of view, saying that, if you adhere to God's law, you flourish, and when you depart from God's law, your civilization collapses. And how many civilizations greater than yours, God asks, have you seen this happen to before? The Quran says to the historian, as it says to the physical scientist, go and look. And that's exactly what Ibn Khaldun does. And so when he goes and looks, and he says, well, actually, I can tell you what the specifics are that people adhere to during the rising phase of civilization and then abandon during the falling phase of civilization. Now, some of these things that he talks about, the most important one, maybe the underlying one, is the concept of Asabiyyah. This is a word that has come under much discussion, an Arabic word, obviously. But I think the best translation of it is social solidarity. The idea is that when a new dynasty arises, the motivations of the people involved in its construction are their solidarity with the group in question that is establishing power.
Like Bayah, like the allegiance.
Allegiance is the formal allegiance of the people to the ruler.
Right.
But what he's talking about is the identification of the ruler with the people. That the ruler sincerely desires the success of the group who have pledged their allegiance to him. Something that disappears in the later phases of the dynasty. And this sense of Asabiyyah means that there is a visceral commitment to the welfare of the group. This manifests itself in certain sound policies that he believes are tied into the background of these people. These are people who have not been in power before. That's what makes it a new dynasty. And therefore, he describes them as people of Bedouin inclinations. Now, what we know about the Bedouins is what? That they're people who have no taste for luxury. Bedouins consider luxury somewhat effeminate and effete, and really cringe at the thought of living. And they like the hard life. They like the struggle of existence. And so, when these people gain power, they are not interested in using it for their own personal, to get luxuries for themselves or for their friends. Rather, they're interested in administering it for the welfare of the group. This, according to Ibn Khaldun, is manifested in the forms of certain sound policies that cause the society to flourish. And what's fascinating is that when he talks about these specific policies, he goes into some considerable specific detail, including in areas, for example, of economics. But first he says that there are certain functions of government, and this is to me very fascinating because often people claim that this concept of the functions, legitimate functions of government that recognizes a context of human rights is an Enlightenment concept. Well, clearly not when you study Ibn Khaldun, because Ibn Khaldun talks about the legitimate purposes of government, and he says that the purpose of government is to preserve the life, the property, the dignity, the religion, and I've forgotten what the fifth one is now.
But happiness.
Well, ultimately, if you look at all these things together, you see a later writer, Thomas Jefferson, would say it's the pursuit of happiness.
Pursuit of happiness. Yeah.
But if you go halfway between Jefferson and Ibn Khaldun, you have John Locke, who talks about the right to life, liberty, and property. Right to life and the right to property, both directly found in Ibn Khaldun. And the concept of liberty could be an abstraction from the other concepts.
Of course, easy thing to do. Yeah. I was been reading some writers that say that Adam Smith also borrowed from Khaldun, but I'll leave that up to
Well, I don't know. Certainly, some of the ideas, the economic ideas in Ibn Khaldun, will be found in Adam Smith. In fact, actually, I think Khaldun was much more consistent than Adam Smith on the economics. But I don't know that there's any evidence of a direct path. Now, there is a possible indirect path. Murray Rothbard, in his massive history of economics, does not go back to Ibn Khaldun's day, but he does go back to the school of Salamanca in Spain and shows how their ideas influence the development of economics in the West. Well, now, while I don't know where the school of Salamanca got its ideas from, but the mere fact that it's in Spain, in the area taken by the Reconquista, where they no doubt would have had access to Ibn Khaldun's writings, it certainly suggests it.
Yeah, let me ask the question. Because obviously before Ibn Khaldun, there is a difficulty in understanding the evolution of human societies, and he points that in his work he talks about the most important is this is one of his criticisms. He says the most important is the ignorance of the laws governing and transforming human societies. Now, this is obviously something that he is going to give us in the heart part of the work that he presents to us. Give me your comments about that. I mean, here's a man looking at the crumbling of his own society, and I gather in that kind of desperation, he puts together this science.
Well, you know, a lot of people, they look at Ibn Khaldun and they ask, was he a determinist? Was he saying that societies must inevitably crumble? And I don't think he was. I think he was writing as someone who's saying, look, we have some limited free will. We can prevent this from happening if we want to, but acknowledging the forces that make it difficult. Let's take some examples of some of the specific things that he talked about. As I said, when a society is in its early stages of its dynasty, the rulers have this commitment to social solidarity and to certain sound policies. These policies are so good for the society becomes very successful, and the amount of luxuries increases. And the government, even though it may have very low tax rates, acquires huge tax revenues and is able to do all kinds of things, building magnificent mosques and libraries, schools and hospitals, whatever it may be, and distributing favors to the favorites of the ruler.
Sure.
As new generations are raised up of rulers, the offspring of the original rulers are raised up in this environment, they begin to think the purpose of government is to collect the taxes and to distribute these luxuries.
This sounds familiar.
Rather than, well, again, you see.
I mean, it sounds like the Democratic Party, but
it applies. Ibn Khaldun would say it applies at any time in history, both up to his time or after it. And so there are even particular policies. For example, what is known as the Laffer curve. The economist Arthur Laffer, who said that high tax rates yield low revenues and low tax rates yield high revenues. Actually, Ibn Khaldun had said this before, only he said it more strongly with a sociological element besides the economic. He said, in their beginnings, dynasties obtain high tax revenues from low tax rates, and near their end obtain low tax revenues from high tax rates. What happens is that as their general overall policies become harmful to the society, and the society becomes less productive, and the revenues start to fall, instead of changing the policies, they raise the tax rates. But raising the tax rates only makes things worse. And as the tax rates get high enough, the productive people in society begin to have the impression, as Ibn Khaldun puts it, that their efforts are only for the benefit of, that their efforts to create wealth is only for the purpose of having it taken away from them. Whereupon they stop creating wealth. And when the productive people stop creating wealth, the society becomes increasingly impoverished. This causes the rulers to raise the taxes.
Of course, it sounds like something that I've just read, actually. It sounds like something from the conservative movement that talks about the negative effects of raising taxes on people who are the most productive in society.
There are other things that one can find in the similar with the conservatives and also with some liberals. For example, his disdain for the government getting involved in commercial activity. This is he discusses this in a section called "Why the Ruler's Involvement in Commerce Brings About the Destruction of Civilization." That it is unreasonable for the ruler's job is to be the arbiter, to keep people from cheating one another, the people who are engaged in commerce, to keep them honest. If the ruler himself engages in commerce, he's in a unique position where he can limit prices of the goods that are sold to him. He can put floors on the prices of the goods that he sells to others. He can be biased in adjudication of disputes that affect himself. He can get coerced labor by corvée and force the people to work in his industries. He essentially destroys his ability to be a good ruler, even as he becomes a bad businessman.
You know, the interesting thing as I read about his philosophy, he negates constitution that he doesn't rely on written constitution, as much as he relies on natural law. It seems to me that is his focus. Now, of course, we could easily see how people could come behind him and look at his writings and bring together a constitution that would be meaningful for society. But he seems to be relying more on the more
well,
ethical
he himself
law.
doesn't discuss constitutionalism.
Right, right.
And I think that there are probably a couple of reasons for this. First off, I don't think he would have felt that it was essential to his point if a constitutional process could be relied on to implement his ideas, he would have been in favor of it. But I don't think he assumed that that would be the case. And indeed, if we look at the history of our constitutional republic and see that it follows the same pattern to which he ascribed to the more monarchical dynasties of his time, in other words, the people in their democratic process are just as prone to this kind of corruption as the ruling elites would be. And I think someone said that a democracy will only be successful until the majority realizes that it can plunder the minority.
Sure. Interesting idea. I like hearing your analysis of this. Now, I'm curious. Here we have an idea that is written in the 14th century. Are these ideas applicable now in terms of modern thinkers of this philosophy?
There's a great interest today in Ibn Khaldun. In fact, what's fascinating is that there was more interest as time went on. In his own day, he was pretty much
alone in his philosophy.
He influenced other intellectuals and other academics, but I don't see that he had any lasting influence on any of the rulers at the time. It wasn't until the Ottoman Empire that you saw Muslims begin to say, hey, we should look. But even among the Ottomans, it was the intellectuals again who, looking at the decline of the Ottoman Empire, were saying, we think Ibn Khaldun has something to say about why we're in this situation. The rulers were not really very good at adopting any of these ideas for the same reasons that Ibn Khaldun would say, that because they'd reached a point where they misunderstood the function of government. Subsequently, the same things happened. Ibn Khaldun, I was quite astonished when Ronald Reagan, in talking about the Laffer curve, identified Ibn Khaldun as its source. And I didn't realize at the time, I said he must have had some intellectual speechwriter. But subsequently, one of his speechwriters told me that that Ronald Reagan had read Ibn Khaldun.
Oh, that's great.
Which quite surprised me.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all, because it seems to me the philosophy is dead on. I was curious about this, because it seems to me that we're creating the same mistakes that he is predicting in the 14th century. We are now creating the same mistakes over and over and over again. And I think we had talked about it earlier, how it is that how is that our leaders tend to ignore the natural evolutions of various different societies, and sometimes they elect themselves as the creator or recreating societies by their own will. And I was curious. I believe that this is kind of ignoring and people. It causes people to rush to war and rush to judgment, because they're not willing to have the patience to watch a society evolve naturally. But give me your feelings about that. It certainly would give a case for wait and see instead of rush to war.
Well, I think that one of the things that Ibn Khaldun talked about was the role of empire, expansion of empire. And of course, other writers before him had noticed that, when empires get overextended, they tend to get weak. But Ibn Khaldun tied it into his overall theory. It fits in with his master theory, that this extension of empire comes from a generation of people who are used to extending the empire of the state, and therefore it doesn't occur to them that this might be an unwise thing to do, that there may be a point beyond which the effects become negative. You overextend yourself, you're diverting too many of the resources to the purpose of the state, war making, and away from the purposes of the population, who are the creator of the goods. extension of empire naturally requires high taxes or high inflation, which was another thing that Ibn Khaldun talked about. He didn't talk about it in terms of modern credit markets, which they didn't have, but in terms of debasement of the money supply, which was the same thing. That at the time, gold, in the Muslim world especially, for the first 400 years, gold was the only money that was used, and silver, hard wheat, commodity money, as was the sunnah of the Prophet. By Ibn Khaldun's time, people had begun to debase the currency, to issue coins that said 1 dinar, but a dinar is a weight. It's 4¼ grams of whatever the coin's made of. So, but instead of 4¼ grams of gold, the coin might have copper mixed in with it. So it might well be a 4¼ gram coin, but it was not 4¼ grams of gold. And therefore, the value of the coin was less than what it said it was. And surprise, surprise, it bought less in the marketplace, to the frustration of the people who got the coin later. Now, the ones who are minting these coins, being virtual counterfeiters, they're selling them at face value, and because it's the state who's minting the coin, they're forcing people to give the face value of the coin in exchange. Well, we do the same thing today in a more complicated way with the Federal Reserve Board. We don't use gold anymore. It's John Maynard Keynes declared it a barbaric relic. But the fact is that now the government has no limits on the amount of credit that it pumps into the economy. And so when we have expansion of empire as we have today, a war in Iraq costing billions of dollars, $80 billion, and I think was the most recent extension of credit, that where's that $80 billion going to come from? You either tax the people, and this particular administration doesn't want to tax people, or you expand credit. In which case you decrease the value of the money by the amount that you have de facto taxed. Now you're taking the money away not from the taxpayer, but from future generations.
Well, this is interesting. I want to explore more of this with you, but just in a short synopsis, is Khaldun relevant in contemporary thinkers? I mean, obviously, but I want to say.
I do think he's obviously relevant, and I think that what needs to be done is to actually take advantage of his writings in order to do the kind of explorations that we're doing here. And I'm glad to see that some of his ideas are being talked about.
Dr. Imad ad-Deen Ahmad, thank you for an excellent Scholars Chair. That is the end of our program, and it goes so quickly here. But if you want to know more about the Scholars Chair, go to www.scholarschair.com. If you want to know more about the Islamic Society, go to 301. Call us at 301-567-3359. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.
فعلم ما لم تعلموا فجعل من دون ذلك فتحا قريبا